Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. Today we're going to take a look at democracies and how they're moving and growing and maturing, or maybe the opposite, around the world. My guest today is an expert in this area. My guest today is Annika Savill. Ms. Annika Savill is the director of the United Nations Democracy Fund, and this is a position she's held for the past several years. Prior to joining the United Nations, she had a 15-year career as a journalist serving with the Associated Press, Reuters, and the Independent, where she was a freelance writer and diplomatic editor. Annika Savill, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Thank you, Bill. Always good to be back.
Yes, right. This is the second time, I think.
Third?
Third time. Good memory. Thank you. We need to stay abreast of what's going on with democracies. They are critical, as you know much better than I do. But let's talk a little bit about the UN Democracy Fund. When was it started? Why was it formed? And what's your main mission?
Sure. It was created in 2005 by Kofi Annan, then Secretary General, in response really to what some governments felt was a need to support civil society, i.e. that which is not the state nor the market, complementing the UN's work in support of governments for well-governed societies. So for the past 13 years, we have conducted an increasing number of projects, increasing number of countries. There's barely any country now that we have not been active in. There are very few exceptions. And all of them support the voice of all groups in democratic processes through civil society.
And our viewers can go to your website at un.org/democracyfund.
Correct.
To get more information. Now, there are 193 countries in the United Nations General Assembly. Basically, they're the board of directors. I guess many people look at them like that. How many of those countries are you operating in? You mentioned quite a few, just roughly.
More than 100, I would say, 110 or so. We have 50 new projects every year. Each project is 2 years long, so we've conducted by now 700 two-year projects, and as I say, more than 110, I would say. Almost every middle and low-income country we have been active in, which is a challenge because it's not everybody's favorite theme in terms
Yes,
of the
I
membership of the United Nations. But on the other hand, they do welcome the United Nations in this area rather than a bilateral donor who might carry more political baggage, if I can put it like that.
Yes, you're much more neutral, and you can come in as someone who wants to help, wants to provide technical assistance, that type of thing. Are there certain areas of the world where you're operating more? Are you operating in the Arab world,
Yes.
the African continent,
Yes.
Asia?
Yes. All of what you mentioned, plus Latin America and Eastern Europe to some extent. We try not to duplicate the work of the European Union, so not those countries, but the former Soviet space, yes. So Russia, Belarus, the Caucasus, we do operate in as concerns Europe. Very much sub-Saharan Africa, very much the Arab states, particularly after the events of 2011 with the changing landscape there. And very much the front lines around Syria, where we do projects to, for example, empower refugee women. Obviously all of Asia and all of Latin America as well.
Now that's quite a bit, and you don't have a large staff,
Correct.
I've got a feeling. Is that correct? Yes.
That's correct. So the model is that we invite civil society organizations around the world every year to submit a proposal. We receive 2,000 to 3,000 proposals per annum, of which about 50 are selected for support from us.
50 out of that large number.
That's a rate pretty much equivalent to getting into Harvard University.
Yes.
So
it's a very select field, a select group, I should say.
It is. And they are rigorously assessed at the proposal stage by experts and by the UN system. And then they are supported by our staff here throughout the lifespan of the project, and also to some extent by the UN family in the field, so that we do get support in monitoring the project from UNDP and other country team actors. It's an excellent example in its own small way of the one UN concept, where parts of the UN family provide some sort of synergy in support of a common cause.
That's very important. Now, you basically provide these, most of them non-governmental organizations that are working with you on this, on these projects, is that correct? The funding, when you fund, you have the funding mechanisms that go to them. How do you evaluate the success of the project? How do you look at the effectiveness and the efficiency of that particular project?
So we have, this is getting a bit technical, but we do have a very developed now system of post-project evaluations where we have independent experts go in after the close of the project to see what was the impact, what was the relevance, what lessons learned can be drawn from this. And then, as I said, during the lifespan of the project, we have a very rigorous monitoring system where they must meet certain milestones that they committed to at the beginning. And that's, as I said, where the UN family comes in and monitors the milestone activities.
Now, earlier on in the conversation, you referenced that sometimes the formation of democracies is not a favorite topic of some countries, especially when you have some autocrats who want to set up their own operation or have nationalistic feelings and that type of thing. That's a very delicate area and one that you would have to display. You have the technical expertise, but you'd have to display a tremendous amount of diplomacy to walk that fine line, because you can't just go into a country and say, I'm here to set up a democracy. You have to be working with that government as well as the civil society members. Is that correct?
That's correct. So as you imply, it does require quiet diplomacy. It's not a situation in those contexts where you want to go in all guns blazing, but you can have some quiet exchanges that lead to a common understanding. And in environments like that, it can sometimes help to start with a project that is not in such a provocative field. I try to look at entry point themes such as social and economic rights, where the government feels that it may have some experience to offer, so that it's more of a two-way exchange rather than us coming in like a missionary and telling people or civil society or governments what to do. So in the case of some environments that I mentioned earlier, we've started, for example, with the rights of HIV positive women. And in some countries, the government has worked in that area in a rudimentary way, more on the economic front, and we come in with a rights-based approach to complement that, so that they feel that, as I said, it's more of an exchange between equals at the beginning anyway. Once that trust is built, you can sometimes do projects in future rounds that are more political in theme, if I can put it like that.
Now, we've been using the term democracy, and I guess democracy means that different things. If we had three people here, we'd have four definitions of democracy, probably. How do you define democracy? Is there a generic definition for it, or are there certain stages that you go through when you're developing a democracy? But how do you, from the textbook example, how would you define that term?
Here in the UN, we're very fond of repeating that there is no one model that suits all societies, and that there is no one pace of building democracy that works for everyone. And that's certainly true, and that must be respected. But there are also, we must remember, most definitely some common elements without which you cannot call yourself a democracy. And that, of course, is the right to elect your own leaders, the right to enjoy the human rights that are in the Universal Declaration, and for that matter, the rights of women. And the degree to which and the pace at which you come to that may vary, but that must at least be the acknowledged elements. A free and vibrant civil society, I would say, is another. Independent judiciary, and a well-functioning media independent of the state. Those things exist in part in some democracies, other parts exist in other parts, and so it's a jigsaw puzzle for some. But we must be careful when we say and we keep repeating decade after decade that there is no one model that suits everybody, because we lose the plot then on the basics that need to be in place, and that we're all traveling in a direction that we understand, even if the pace, as I say, can vary.
You mentioned women a minute ago.
I did.
Caught my ear because Global Connections Television, the two issues we cover everything from A to Z: nuclear disarmament, human trafficking, economic development, whatever, but we always try to focus on climate change and women, the role of women and girls. What role do you see, or what role have women played in helping to foment democracies, and what role can they play if they have even more say in what's happening in many countries? Of course, this varies from country to country, obviously, but what do you see as the role of women being actively involved in this whole democratic process?
So, I often go back to something the Deputy Secretary General has said about that, which is that
This Amina Mohammed.
Amina J. Mohammed, who
Okay.
is the torchbearer on our road to the Sustainable Development Goals, the goals on which we all agree, all the world's governments agree, are what we are working for towards 2030. And she calls gender equality and women's empowerment the docking station for all the other goals to come true. You cannot get to all the other aspirations that we have in social and economic development unless we empower women to get there. And I think the docking station image is one that works very well, especially for younger people today. I think that hits the mark pretty well.
Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is a privately funded, independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guest. We would invite our viewers to go to our website at www.globalconnectionstelevision.com to view previous programs. Also, if you're involved with a PBS or a community access television station, or perhaps an educational institution that has an intra-campus television hookup, or you just have a website, you like our shows and you want to share them, please feel free to do so. Global Connections Television is provided free as a public service to help us better understand international issues and how they impact our lives. Today we're talking with Ms. Annika Savill, and she is the chief director, the chief head, I should say, of the United Nations Democracy Fund. I think you've laid out a great overview of this whole situation with democracies. I think back to the late 80s, 89, when we saw the melting of the Cold War. We saw shortly after that the breakup of the Soviet Union. 14 of the republics of the Soviet Union, many of them wanted to move into being democracies. You had many of the countries in the Eastern European bloc that were moving in that direction, as I recall, Romania, Hungary, Poland, different ones like that. Today, are we seeing a movement more towards countries that want to develop their democracies, or is there a retreat? I know we've seen attacks on democratic institutions and on the human rights by a large number of countries, which I might mention in a few minutes. But anyway, what do you, how do you see that movement going today? Are we going in the right direction? Are we treading water, or are we going backwards?
Sure. It's a mixed picture, and there has been a great deal of alarm about what's called democratic backsliding or democratic erosion, or both, including in some of the countries that you referred to in Eastern Europe. Those countries that were actively moving forward, embracing the new rights, the new development that democracy brings, are now sort of rebelling against that. That may be partly a generational thing, that the generation that brought all that in is now not in leadership positions anymore, and it's a little bit like the revolution kills its fathers. But it's also, of course, in those countries, to some extent, a result of society changing, becoming more open, migration becoming more pervasive. Even though those countries are not necessarily subjected to migration, they sense some sort of erosion of their Christian values or what have you. And so society is a little bit torn in various directions. That's true in those countries, but we should also be mindful that some scholars and observers of democracy are more worried about the longer established democracies in some of those, and of course no names mentioned, but whether there is also there a questioning of some forms of what democracy brings. One can't say that the number of democracies has gone down, so it's not like that. It's more the quality of it, and that's where we need to be mindful. And I would say particularly where we are in the UN Democracy Fund working on the front lines is civil society, i.e. the rights of NGO activists and such, very much becoming curtailed in many countries, regardless of geography now. It's become an almost explosive trend for the past 7 years or so, where they all copy each other in legislation that curtails and restricts the right of NGOs to operate. And that's a cause of concern for many. And an equally concerning development is the attacks against parliamentarians. In this country you'd call it congressmen, but or congresswomen. The attacks on the elected are an incredibly serious threat to democracy, because if you have those who exist to represent you and me being attacked either through violence, harassment, hate speech, or in some countries even arrest and imprisonment, by whomsoever it may be, that is really when you're attacking the core of a very concept of democracy.
Mm-hmm. And of course, that's right. And that's one of the basic tenets of a democracy, is to have an environment, the framework wherein people can discuss their differences, they can discuss policies, they can maybe not agree on everything, but still work towards a common end, and not break up into tribes, and not hurl insults and barbs and sometimes violent acts against one another. And of course, that's counterproductive. And you'll never come to a good conclusion. Let's use a pejorative term there, a good conclusion doing that.
Indeed, and lest we think that we may come from such a civilized society. This happens in every society. The country where I was born, Sweden, everybody thinks of it as one of the top 5 in terms of established democracies. And I just read a survey last month that in this year alone, more than 900 elected officials have been subject to either physical or hate speech harassment. That's 1 in 5 of those surveyed. I'm just mentioning that as an example. It's a very serious development. It
certainly is. And there are many reasons for this to cause people to break into tribes, warring tribes with each other. But I just wonder, it just crossed my mind a minute ago, that one situation is getting extremely dangerous, especially in the United States, whereas it used to just, we always said, well, look at Latin America. Now that we just say, look at the United States, that's an income inequality. And that is a situation that we've basically hollowed out a large part of the middle class in this country. Their purchasing power is down. The unions have been gutted to a large degree. It's a very dangerous situation, and it's not what produced. I'll just, since I'm an American, I live in the, let's say I'm from the U.S. and live in the United States, that it's not going to produce a society that's very well off, or as well off as we were maybe back in the 70s, 80s, 90s, in that period. But how much of a role does income inequality play as you talk to people around the world, as far as either helping or hindering with your effort to promote democratic initiatives?
So there is not infrequently among young people a loss of faith in democracy if they see the income inequality being pervasive and insurmountable. And we see that, for example, in countries where there was great hope after the Arab Spring. Tunisia is obviously the one country that is still considered a well-functioning democracy after the Arab Spring. And that came about, the Arab Spring there came about not just because people embraced the notion of liberties, but also because they learned about corruption, about the incredible over-endowment of the ruling class and of the presidential family at the time. And that's a big part of what led to the protests spreading. So what brought young people to the streets was income inequality, and also the perception that it was not come by honest means. Now, what we find in countries like that is that those who embrace democracy especially the young people, are in a tension with those who feel marginalized, and you can see, particularly in rural societies, that these groups, the marginalized versus those who have an occupation and are still activists for democracy, have an almost palpable tension between them, largely due to, as you describe, income inequality, yes.
And sometimes tied into that, not directly, but indirectly perhaps, is the use of artificial intelligence. We're seeing now that many workers are being displaced through the use of robotics. It's going to accelerate on steroids is what's going to happen. We can see it right now. It's not tomorrow, it's today, it's taking place. Does this whole discussion of artificial intelligence tie into your area of discussion, and how does it affect it one way or the other?
I think it will do. What you describe is still very much, for the purposes of our grassroots activism, a first world phenomenon, if I can call it like that, and it certainly is a factor in this country and in parts of Europe. Where we work, I think that is yet to come. It will be a huge challenge in the next few decades, I'm sure.
Now, earlier you mentioned the Sustainable Development Goals, and we can't end the program before we talk about them for a moment. These are 17 logical, quantifiable goals to hopefully be achieved by between 2016 and 2030. The goal to empower women, to eradicate poverty, to eradicate hunger. Are there certain, all goals, are very beneficial, they're excellent goals. Are there certain ones that you focus on more than others in your work?
So, that's a really great question. There is, of course, a goal that directly relates to democracy, and that's goal 16, which is peace, justice, and institutions. And certainly that does have the almost explicit, not quite explicit mention of democracy, but the almost explicit link to it. But if you look at all the 16 or 17 goals, you will see that the idea of universal access is what runs through them like a golden thread, no? It's the idea that we all have the right to clean water, to decent work, to less income equality, as you mentioned. That universal access is in itself the concept of democracy, is it not? So as we move towards democracy, we can't do that by working for goal 16 alone. We have to work for all of the goals in tandem, and that is indeed the spirit of the goals, is that you should not just pick and choose, but you should see them all as a holistic totality.
And that will help create a better society, a more equitable society, and one where everybody will benefit as opposed to just a handful of people.
Yes, and vice versa. In a democratic system, a participatory system, social and economic development has a much larger chance of taking hold in a true sense if everybody has a say in how we do it and a stake in the outcome. And that's, study after study has shown us that that's the case. So it's a two-way street, very much symbiotic.
It certainly is. And this area is so important. The issue is so important. We need to hear more about it. We need the media to cover programs that you're involved in, projects that you're involved in, and to keep that discussion going, because we have basically, I think, fallen back a bit on this. We're going in some areas in the wrong direction as far as how we discuss very thorny public policies, and policies that are very difficult. They're not easy to resolve. In many cases, you have people who are following the money as opposed to the common good, the public good, and you got that in every society, I'm sure, to some degree. But it's extremely important that we do that, and we focus attention on areas of the world that perhaps could use our help or whatever. And I just think of the different countries around the world. I'm not going to start picking on countries, but I think of the countries like the Philippines, Hungary, Egypt, the United States. There has been a withdrawal to some degree in the democratic area and the human rights area too. But Annika Savill, I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Always a pleasure.
Thank you. My pleasure. I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us today on Global Connections Television.